On the 23rd of November 1644, at the height of the English Civil War, the poet, scholar and intellectual John Milton published the celebrated prose polemic Areopagitica. This controversial pamphlet, which took its name from the Greek Areopagitikos, a speech written by Athenian orator Isocrates in the 4th century BC, put forward an impassioned philosophical defence of the principle of a right to freedom of speech and expression. As a political radical, Milton had supported the Presbyterians in Parliament and would later work as a civil servant for the new republic. However, in this work he argued forcefully against Parliament's 1643 Ordinance for the Regulating of Printing, in which Parliament required authors to have a licence approved by the government before their work could be published. This issue was personal for Milton, as he'd suffered censorship himself in his efforts to publish several tracts defending divorce, a radical stance which met with no favour from the censors. Areopagitica therefore argued against the censorship of books before their publication, celebrating the vitality of books and condemning their destruction, saying one might as good almost kill a man as kill a good book. Milton's stance here is, in many ways, ahead of his time. Whilst we may assume that censorship of ideas and the banning of books is a relatively modern phenomenon, in reality the issue of literary censorship has existed since the printed word began. So, to understand where this principle of censorship comes from and its problematic relationship with freedom of expression, I believe we can learn much from Areopagitica and its ideological context. Milton begins his polemic with an exploration of the purpose of reading. He argues that to be learned, like figures such as Moses, David and St. Paul, one must be well read. Interestingly, Milton chooses to reference religious figures here who would have all been instantly recognisable as knowledgeable and whose good and prophetic wisdom was something to aspire to and emulate. However, Milton shifts away from this paradigm to suggest that, in his eyes, it is clear that reading should include even the bad or heretical books. He argues that we can learn from their wrongs and discover what is true by considering what is not true. Milton goes on to argue that as readers, we should be trusted to read different ideas in print and use reason to choose between them rather than having temptation removed through censorship. What wisdom can there be to choose without the knowledge of evil, he observes. He also draws on the biblical story of the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve sin by tasting the forbidden fruit. Although some people might blame God for allowing Adam to transgress, Milton praises him for giving humans freedom to choose, for reason is but choosing. Milton's overarching point, then, is that the mind is not corrupted simply by encountering falsehood, and that God endowed every person with the reason, free will and conscience to judge ideas for themselves. Therefore, Milton argues, the ideas in a text should be rejected by the reader's own choice, not by a licensing authority. Sadly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Areopagitica did not persuade the Presbyterians in Parliament to invalidate the pre-publication censorship component of the Licensing Order of 1643, and freedom of the press in this sense was not achieved until 1695, when the Parliament chose not to renew the order. However, understanding Milton's audience moves us towards an understanding of why his polemic was unsuccessful. Milton and the Presbyterians had together abolished the Star Chamber, the English court responsible for the fair enforcement of laws, which had ironically become synonymous with social and political oppression through the arbitrary use and abuse of the power it wielded. But now that they were not being oppressed and they held the power, the Presbyterians in Parliament no longer held to their defence of freedom of the press. Through the Licensing Order of 1643, they were set on silencing the more radical Protestants, the Independents, as well as works supporting the king which had begun to appear in London. It is clear, therefore, that while freedom of speech and expression had been welcomed at a time when the Presbyterians needed to develop their power and encourage others to support them, as soon as they achieved power, freedom of expression became a potential threat to the newly established status quo. With no sense of irony, works of literature which promoted divisive ideologies now had to be suppressed at all costs. It is interesting too that Milton's argument also placed a burden of expectation upon readers to be capable of critical thought and evaluation of different ideological positions experienced through works of literature. Milton's assumption that people can make judgments about what constitutes a good or bad book relies on a certain level of education and life experience. In reality, it's fair to say that then and now, not all readers are equally able to navigate textual nuance and to sort the moral wheat from the chaff. If we move forward to December 1948, we see the same concerns being addressed. Following the horrors of the Second World War, the United Nations General Assembly agreed upon and adopted a universal set of basic human rights. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights enshrined the rights and freedoms of all human beings and was established to prevent the human rights abuses observed during war from ever happening again. Article 19 of the Declaration states, as did Milton 300 years earlier, that everyone has the right to freedom of expression and opinion. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. By 1948, clearly, the historical context has changed, but the intellectual one has not. The specifics of social, cultural and political oppression might be different, but both Areopagitica and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights acknowledge that there are active threats to literary and verbal expression which we must protect ourselves against. Whilst we all have equal rights to express our opinions, history makes it clear that there are always those who attempt to censor and restrict these rights because, fundamentally, saying what we think is potentially dangerous to social and cultural hegemony. Society works on the premise that some attitudes and beliefs are dominant and are upheld by the many. These hegemonic beliefs dictate how the world works and in many ways keep society from descending into chaos. Given that we're social animals, we need a certain commonality of opinion in order for us to live successfully as a cohesive group. As seen in the Presbyterian Parliament of the 1640s, freedom to express attitudes and opinions which support and promote these hegemonic beliefs and attitudes is to be welcomed. However, to paraphrase George Orwell's Animal Farm, not all expression is equal. Freedom of expression is all very well and good, provided that what is being expressed is considered acceptable by those around us. In social terms, no one wants to hear ideas and opinions which actively challenge the central tenets of the societies themselves. It is these ideas which are therefore subject to censorship. Any parts of books, films, news, etc. that are considered, for example, obscene, politically unacceptable, or a threat to security must be suppressed or prohibited if society is to continue functioning within the parameters of hegemony. So, here we have the paradox. Whilst it is our right to express ourselves freely, it is also society's right to suppress this freedom for what it would consider to be the greater good. Luckily for those who wish to censor or suppress expression, speech is inherently ephemeral. Unless it's recorded, saying what you think is transient and easily forgotten. The thousands of people who visit Speaker's Corner in London, for example, all get on their soapboxes to speak their minds, but there's arguably no lasting impact of the majority of their words. Writing, on the other hand, is a very different beast. Writing is permanent. Once an idea has been committed to paper, it takes on a physical as well as a metaphysical life. It has an intrinsic power to influence others that reaches much farther than the spoken word. If the written word holds such power, freedom of expression in a literary form is thus a much more dangerous ideal. Those whose actions and opinions dictate the hegemony are less likely to want to see people writing what they think than simply saying what they think. So, despite Milton's forward-thinking attitude in Areopagitica, literary history has continued to be rife with examples of censorship. Books which have considered to be transgressive or subversive have been and continue to be censored or banned altogether. Perhaps the most infamous example of a banned book is D.H. Lawrence's 1928 novel Lady Chatterley's Lover. A heavily censored version of the novel was published in 1932, 2 years after Lawrence's death, but it wasn't until 1960 that a full version of the novel was published. The publisher, Penguin Books, was then the subject of an obscenity trial, held under the Obscene Publications Act of 1959. The novel was criticised due to its explicit depiction of sex and its use of profanities, although many scholars have suggested that the novel's presentation of the transgression of class boundaries was a more pressing concern for the censors. Penguin won the case and quickly sold 3 million copies. Similarly, Russian-American Vladimir Nabokov's novel Lolita was famously banned and copies of the book were confiscated. The novel controversially focuses on the paedophilic sexual interest of a middle-aged man in a 12-year-old girl who becomes his stepdaughter. Despite featuring grooming, rape and abuse, the novel achieved cult status largely as a result of its banned status. One of the novel's early champions, Lionel Trilling, warned in 1958 of the moral difficulty in interpreting a book with so eloquent and so self-deceived a narrator. He said, "We find ourselves the more shocked when we realise that in the course of reading the novel, we have come virtually to condone the violation it presents. We have been seduced into conniving in the violation because we have permitted our fantasies to accept what we know to be revolting." It isn't just sex, though, that has motivated books to be banned. The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie was first published in 1988 and was inspired in part by the life of Muhammad. As with his previous books, Rushdie used magical realism and relied on contemporary events and people to create his characters. The title refers to the Satanic Verses, a group of Quranic verses that refer to 3 pagan Meccan goddesses, Alat, Uzzah and Manat. In the United Kingdom, the Satanic Verses received positive reviews, was a Booker Prize finalist and won the Whitbread Award for Novel of the Year. However, major controversy ensued as Muslims accused it of blasphemy and mocking their faith. The outrage among Muslims resulted in a fatwa calling for Rushdie's death issued by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, then Supreme Leader of Iran, on the 14th of February 1989. The result was several failed assassination attempts on Rushdie, who was placed under police protection by the UK government, and attacks on several connected individuals, including the murder of translator Hitoshi Igarashi. The book was banned in India as hate speech directed towards Muslims. If we consider the content of all of these texts alongside the reaction to them, I think it raises a question. Was it right to censor these books? Is it correct that in their context of production, these transgressive and subversive texts were kept from the public eye and denied the chance to exert any negative influence? On one hand, the answer could be yes. If we are relying on readers to make their own judgments of texts, it's not unreasonable that texts which are deliberately morally ambiguous in their presentation, such as Lolita, should be hidden from view as they may incite or encourage readers to copy the transgressive acts depicted. On the other hand, Milton would certainly have said no. It is better to experience literature without censorship in order that we can make our own educated decisions about what is right and wrong, and we can only truly comprehend right by experiencing wrong. Equally, in many ways, censoring or banning books is counterproductive. Nowadays, many classic banned books are considered to be more titillating or appealing purely as a result of the fact that they were censored. Let's not forget that it's human nature to want the things that we're told we can't have, or say the things that we're told not to say. A common outcry nowadays is that we are living in a cancel culture. There is an argument that our society is intrinsically censorious, and the nature of information that we receive and the way in which we receive it is being controlled and restricted. There is a base level of political correctness that we must keep to, and anything which goes against this is deemed fair game for censorship. In July 2020, an open letter was published in Harper's Magazine entitled "A Letter on Justice and Open Debate." In this letter, writer Thomas Chatterton Williams set out the argument that the world is becoming increasingly censorious and that our right of expression is being eroded by those who seek to control our speech, our art and our writing. The letter was countersigned by notable literary and academic figures such as Margaret Atwood, Noam Chomsky, J.K. Rowling and Salman Rushdie. The letter states, "The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. While we have come to expect this on the radical right, censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture. An intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counterspeech from all quarters, but it is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. The letter goes on. The restriction of debate, whether by a repressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation. The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. We refuse any false choice between justice and freedom, which cannot exist without each other. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking and even mistakes. Now, there is a problem here. Whilst the Harper's letter is admirable in its intention to raise the issue of censoriousness and intolerance as experienced by writers, it's also notably thin when it comes to specific examples. It hides behind a front of moral indignation without really delving into just what it is that the radical right and liberal society perceive as transgressions. We know from our previous explorations of Areopagitica and banned books that transgressions are ideological positions which challenge the cultural hegemony, divorce, explicit sexuality, paedophilia, blasphemy, etc. However, what the Harper's letter perhaps fails to acknowledge is that hegemony shifts. The perception of what constitutes a transgression of speech and thought has changed and continues to change in relation to developments in society. There is, therefore, no simple justification for either censorship or the counter-narrative of the cancel culture. As an example, J.K. Rowling, one of the people who signed the Harper's letter, was called out after her comments about transgender women, which she expressed in a public forum and which were largely considered to be at best insensitive and at worst transphobic. In response to being labelled a TERF, Rowling published a letter which explored her own experiences as a woman who was domestically and sexually abused, a move which many saw as an attempt to cancel her original comments by cynically diverting the narrative onto cis rather than trans women. To take another example, in Trump's America, there was a dominant cultural belief in fake news, and not just the unreliability of the free press, but the deliberate manipulations and machinations of the press to undermine political stability. As a result, there was a new form of censorship whereby anything identified as fake news could be legitimately ignored and metaphorically redacted. This became an embedded and collective cognitive censorship driven and encouraged by Trump himself. Was it right that Rowling was pilloried for her perceived transphobia, or was it an abuse of her human right to self-expression? Was it right that Trump convinced thousands of people that news which contradicted his worldview was fake and should be ignored, or was it his right to freely state his beliefs? In some ways, the fact that these two examples are prominent celebrity figures muddies the water a little. One could argue that there is an extra sense of social responsibility which comes from being in the public eye. Nevertheless, I think that this reveals the nub of the censorship debate. One person's free speech will always be another's intolerant outburst. By its very nature, freedom of expression is always subjective on a personal, social and cultural level. There will always be a tension between freedom of speech and censorship, because there will always be those who look to deny freedom of expression in order to preserve the status quo or to save others from perceived harm or abuse. Whether or not we think that this censorship is right will therefore depend on our own status and beliefs. There can arguably never be a universal standard of censorship, because there can never truly be a universal standard of transgression.